we think that it matters what your state government says about your state when you're thinking about the kind of ecosystem that you want to build. And for the governor and for our team to put out, the welcome sign for entrepreneurs makes a big difference. Beyond our innovation ecosystem, which I know we'll talk about more in this conversation, I think there's some really key things states need to do. They have to be really livable places. And we're lucky in Minnesota to have one of the best park systems in the country, one of the best transportation networks, some of the best schools. We have some great momentum there in livability. There are other areas where we're challenged. Housing and childcare come to mind immediately. You saw over the weekend in the Star Tribune, Minnesota has some of the worst housing shortages of any state in the country. You could say the same for childcare. And if you don't have a place to live or a place to send your kids when you're working, you can't go out and build the next great company. So state government has to focus a lot more on those areas. We have a lot more dollars coming out there from DEED as well. I'd say lastly, because I'm curious to hear what John says too, we got to be listening to the private sector. We have to have our ears open to what business leaders, what entrepreneurs are saying about where our economy is headed. Just last week, the governor launched a new council on economic expansion that is going to help him decide how to spend this next $1 billion of ARP money coming into our state. It is packed with great business leaders. I'll mention two here because they're relevant to this community. One is Scott Burns, the CEO of Structural. Everyone in this community knows Scott. And then Jody Hubler as well, who's the vice chair of the Medical Alley Board, is on that council as well. I should mention Brett Carter, too, as well, from the CIO of Xcel Energies on that group. It's a really great group of 15 leaders that are going to help us navigate this next step. Government can't figure out how to plan for the future of our state in a whiteboard room in St. Paul. We got to be talking to the community. And so I think having those ties between the private sector and government is really important.
Excellent, thank you. John, as you answer, I just want to keep one thing in mind, that as the federal dollars come down, how are you both looking at not building 20th century infrastructure and not the 21st century infrastructure, or using 20th century skill sets or solutions to get into the 21st century? So I want to hear more about you from that, Steve, but let me have John talk about his blueprint and key things there.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sabina. We've seen just how much organizations, public sector or private sector, typically underinvest in innovation and getting ready for the future. And it's understandable. It's because everyone's got a lot on their plate. There's a lot happening right now. There are emergencies. And so people really focus on the here and now, on the urgent challenges of today, but sometimes they forget to look ahead a little bit. And the benefit of the role that I have as Chief Technology Officer of New York City is that's my job. My job is to look around the corner, and it's not necessarily 10 or 20 years out. It might be 2 or 3 months out. It might be 6 months out or 12 months out, and really trying to make sure that we are ready for what's coming, because change is inevitable. And we knew that society was becoming ever more digital. And then, of course, the pandemic arrived, and all of a sudden that change accelerated. And so we benefited from the fact that we were preparing, but it also showed everybody that we needed to prepare even more. We needed to invest even more. We needed to pay more attention to the direction the world was heading. And I think Steve did a great job highlighting probably the number one issue, which is talent. It's people. So if we invest in our people, both within government and all across society, that's the absolute most important thing that we can do. But I would also say there's more that goes into it, because if you want to have a healthy ecosystem, an ecosystem that's not just a tech sector, but it's the role of technology in society, because of course today technology is a part of everything. It's a part of our education, a part of our healthcare, a part of how we live and connect with one another. And so to do that, we want to make sure we've got the talent and the understanding and the skill sets, but also capital, governance, policies, cross-sector collaborations, to make those connections, because there's a lot of amazing stuff happening in academia, great stuff happening in the foundation space, in government, and we need to connect those pieces. So when I think of the ecosystem, I agree that the talent and people are the absolute most important part of it. But I think to really build a sustaining ecosystem that drives us into the future in a way where we don't fear the future, we don't try to keep the future out. It's not about future-proofing New York City, it's about making New York City future ready. And that's what we're trying to do, and I'm glad to see that's what's happening in Minnesota as well.
Great. The other question, which the two most used words in the last 1.5 years that I've come across is, I don't have access to technology. I'm not connected. I can't access healthcare. So the pandemic showed us that the role of technology in our lives, right? And then there's an equity issue around technology. So when you are talking about ecosystems and getting the private sector in and building for the future, it has to go down to the level where everybody has access, right? So I want to hear a little bit more about that, because today we spend a lot of time talking about BIPOC communities, underserved communities, and how we serve them and how we uplift them. And without technology, nobody is going anywhere in a hurry. So love to hear both your comments on that.
I mean, this is the issue for our state in particular, given this moment in history that we're in. I think there's small answers to this question, and then there's big answers to this question. The small answers are, in every program or funding pool or initiative that we roll out, you've got to have targeted funding that disproportionately targets people of color, women, and veterans, and particularly people of color, given how much the pandemic has affected those communities more so than others. And so we've done that across our Angel Tax Credit, Launch Minnesota, Business Technical Assistance programs. That's important. You have to have those targeted dollars. But if you just are about, incrementally changing the percentage that goes to a particular community of dollars and not thinking about the system as a whole, you're really missing something that's a much bigger story. And so one of the things that we're undergoing in our agency right now, whose basic job is to churn out hundreds of millions of dollars every year back into the state economy to help it grow, is to ask ourselves, where is the system breaking down? What systemic changes do we need to make this a more prosperous state for people of color? And so we're doing that through a whole host of internal initiatives and goal-setting frameworks that, may sound kind of strategic and technical, but at the end of the day, they're going to lead to us taking a swing at some pretty big systematic changes. One of them is the Workforce Development Fund that exists in this state. It is a fund that is paid into by employers across the state to help build the talent in Minnesota. And it is a great, unique differentiator in our economy. Not many states have this fund. In fact, we might be the only one. But it is still built in the same structures within which it was founded in like the late 1980s. And so we've got to update that for the economy that we have today. In the next 10 years, 70% of Minnesota's population growth is going to be people of color. So this is not just a moral imperative, but an economic one. But I do think it's impossible to ignore the fact that in the last year and a half, Minnesota has gotten global attention for, in some ways, the wrong reasons, right? The murder of George Floyd, all that transpired afterwards, a seminal moment in American history, and it all started right here. We need to embrace the fact that Minnesota needs to be a state where things start to change and not miss this moment, this inflection point, to lean into Minnesota being a place that can make progress here, make real progress here. The whole world is watching Minnesota. And when we talk about marketing our state outside of Minnesota, when we talk about drawing the kind of talent in that we would love to see flow into our state, we have to address this issue head on. And not in flowery language or talking points, but with real initiatives. And so as we've begun to fine-tune our sort of marketing message for Minnesota, we've just embraced the fact that this is a topic we need to address. When we talk to HR directors and talent recruiters and marketing specialists at companies across Minneapolis and St. Paul, they tell us, focus on this issue, show the momentum that's happening, be honest and real about it, and show that Minnesota's seizing this moment. And I do think that we are. Solutions aren't short and easy, but we have to focus on them, and that's part of this broader story too, that has to be at the center of our next focus. And I'm proud to say there's a lot of efforts in the private sector and public sector that show me this does feel different than the way it's felt in the past decades.
Yeah, Steve, I just wanted to add there, I do a lot of work in the grassroots community here, and I'm an entrepreneur, so I see the dollars coming down, but the gap is of the access from here to the dollars, right? There's a gap there, because think about a high school student and they have no access to tech skills or the innovation or the ecosystem because they've never seen that. So how do you push that into the grassroots is a big thing that I want to work on as an entrepreneur, but also make sure that the government is addressing.
Yeah, and John may have some insights for us to draw from here too. I'll just say quickly that one of the things we really believe in is supporting capacity building organizations that do just that. So whether that's Launch Minnesota or any of our 80 partners across the state through our 8 different hubs that we fund for those dollars, or whether it's small and medium-sized business incubators like the Neighborhood Development Center or MEDA, we've got to fund those organizations to have the kind of technical assistance chops to help a new business owner start and get moving. One of the things you see of a small business owner who maybe come from a BIPOC community is they don't have the safety net if things fail. And so they might have the same good idea, but we all know good ideas, they wind and weave, and you fail and you start again. And if you got mom and dad there to help, or your friend or your buddy or your professor or whoever, like, you have a safety net. But if you're a BIPOC entrepreneur, you don't have that ecosystem to be supported by. So I'm sure John and his team deal with this in other ways too, but that's how we're thinking about it, is it's not just about the entrepreneur themselves, but the network around them.
Yeah. John.
A lot of really good points made there. When I think about technology and equity, it all comes back to broadband. It comes back to the simple starting point of connectivity. And unfortunately, when we released our internet master plan from New York City in early 2020, we saw just how stark the inequity was. At that time, 2 out of every 5 New Yorkers were at least underconnected, and 1 out of every 5 were actually disconnected. They did not have broadband, mobile or at home. And of course, that disproportionately affected people of color, those who had the lowest incomes in the community. And if you laid the map of broadband adoption over the city, it looked like a racial census of the city. And it really reflected decades of underinvestment in communities. And it really looked like digital redlining. That's what it looked like. And it's not something we can snap our fingers and solve overnight, but our internet master plan gave us a roadmap of how to do that, how to do it iteratively, how to put together a collection of different technologies, different approaches to meet the needs of different communities around our 5 boroughs. And ultimately, we ended up choosing to make the largest investment of any municipality in American history, $157 million, which we're currently working through and deploying. But we also did something really creative, which is to put on the table the micro assets that the city itself controls. So think about the hospital buildings, the schools, the light poles on the streets and in the parks. Well, we put those rooms, those rooftops, those facades, the street furniture, the poles, we put that on the table, and we asked the private sector, how would you use these better to provide not just connectivity, but high quality, low cost broadband? Because we know that affordability is the primary barrier in urban environments. And as long as broadband continues to cost $50, $60, $70 a month, there are going to be far too many people left behind. And so we try to use the leverage that we do have and the assets that we have that are attractive to bring people to the table to produce lower cost options than have existed historically. And if we have a functioning competitive market, which unfortunately we really haven't had in the broadband space, if we start to have that, we're going to see prices come down. And we've already seen progress being made, in addition to the work that we did in the pandemic to get tablets in the hands of school kids, over 500,000 tablets sent out by New York City, tens of thousands of older adults living alone, some of the most vulnerable folks during the pandemic, getting them connected with not just devices, but also coaching on how to use those devices. We did all the urgent rapid response stuff, but we recognize that we also need to do the market transformation. And that's what the Internet Master Plan is about. Earlier this year, we announced 45,000 low-income folks living in public housing, getting low-cost broadband. And in fact, when coupled with federal subsidies that are currently in place and should be continuing through the infrastructure bill that's likely to become law, that actually becomes free. So we're making it possible for folks to get online for free, and we expect to have more good announcements, not just for the 45,000 we've already announced, but for hundreds of thousands in the months ahead.
Great. Both of you have heard this, that everybody's talking about broadband being a utility, right? It is. How far do you think we are from there? Are we decades away? Are we years away?
Well, it's a great question. We do often talk about like the modern day plumbing, right? Yeah. And there is some cost to it, but it is in every home, essentially. I don't know how far we are. Maybe John and his team have done some future calculations there. I'll tell you, in Minnesota, we're at about 85% of coverage in the state. Every percent from here to 100 is harder to get. And so one of the things that we're bullish on is new types of technologies here. John mentioned some of those. I'd mention low orbital satellites is another interesting direction that we're happy to see dollars go to if it makes sense. And it's kind of hard to overstate just the flood of money on this topic, even before the infrastructure bill comes, which of course we hope it does. We've got some work to do here. Let's just end this thing, get it done, get connected in Minnesota. If we can be the first state to get there, we'd be thrilled. We've got one of the best offices of broadband in the country, a really great grant program there, but we need more funding and more collaboration on this. So it is an essential part of growth.
Great. One of the questions that, John, you had brought up to me when we were talking a few weeks back was the culture of innovation, right? A lot has changed in the last 1.5 years. We've kind of, and it's a cliche now that we've been thrust into the future. So how are you redefining the culture of innovation within your teams and the government that's going to accelerate what your blueprints are and will support the blueprint, whether you are there or not there tomorrow?
People have a lot of preconceived notions about what it means to work in government, and we are really blowing those up. So the actual way that we operate on a daily basis, we have stand-ups and retros and a lot of the features of the rhythm of business that you might find in a startup, and we're doing that within City Hall. I also look at the people, going back to something that Steve brought up earlier. For too long, there's been a divide between civil servants and technologists, and kind of never the two shall meet. Or if someone is a technologist, they came in to start their career and then they spent 30 years in government. But it wasn't really possible for folks who were technologists who built their experiences and their skills in the private sector to actually get into government, even just for a little bit, and do a tour of duty. Well, that's been changing. In the last decade, a lot of progress has been made at the federal level with the Presidential Innovation Fellows Program that I co-founded and helped start, and then what's grown out of that with 18F and the US Digital Service. And now you look abroad, overseas, all kinds of countries and cities are developing similar ways of bringing technologists inside government to partner them with the folks who've been there for a long time, who have institutional knowledge or policy knowledge that they bring to the table, and together they can get incredible things done. Well, in New York City, the pandemic accelerated this year too, where we had to rely on technologists raising their hands and saying, hey, during this really, really difficult time when New York City got hit early on in the pandemic, especially hard, a lot of people stepped up to the plate and wanted to offer their skills, whether they were data scientists or web developers or product designers. And we figured out ways to connect them to the problems. And what we saw were a couple of things. We saw that the ways they operated, these innovative, again, maybe startup-y ways of being, were actually adopted by the folks in government agencies. They saw the benefit, the value, and they started doing the same thing. And then we also saw that a lot of these technologists who weren't quote-unquote government folks, they kind of got the bug, and they said, I like this. I can make impact at scale. I can really have an impact and help a whole lot of people by doing this. And so some of those folks have now come into government. They actually quit their jobs. They saw the impact they were having. They said, I want to do this all the time, every day. And so now they're public servants. So I think it's really important that we open up avenues so that more and more folks who have tech skills can come into government and see themselves as being part of the solution. And I'll mention one thing that's not about New York City or Minnesota, but it's the federal government. An announcement was made just a week or two ago that the federal government is creating the US Digital Corps. And this is essentially a Peace Corps for folks who are just starting their careers. Maybe they just finished college, but just starting their careers, and they've got some tech skills, and they want to go into public service and give back right away. And now they've got a way of doing that. Before, you really had to go gain experience somewhere else, and a lot of folks never ended up making it back into public service. Well, now there's an on-ramp directly from people getting the skills in school to going into public service through the US Digital Corps. So just a few examples of the things that we do in New York City, but also the things that are happening in so many places to use tech innovation and the culture of innovation to solve public interest problems.
Those are great examples, and the country owes John and the team a debt of gratitude for founding that fellowship program. These are great ways to make it a little bit more accessible to go inside of government from the outside. Speaking from someone who came from Google and went into this job, the transition of private sector folks heading on in is near and dear to my heart. And I think part of it is creating opportunities that are maybe a bit more temporal, so you can hop in and hop out. But part of it, too, is actually creating government agencies that people want to be a part of. I think we have this huge opportunity right now with the crisis of this, I guess, generation, or at least this moment of both a pandemic and racial equity, to use that kind of purpose-driven work that we do in government as a call to action for people to come in. But you got to feel like you're going to be able to make a difference. So we've spent a ton of time over the last 3 years, even before the pandemic, kind of reimagining DEED's culture. We have developed an innovation lab within the organization itself where people can try and test new solutions. That's important because Sometimes failure is not that attractive if you're in government because you're scrutinized so heavily. We've just remade the fundamentals of the organization, from performance management to goal setting, to just the basics of how we connect over communications channels like town halls and regular emails and updates. It's these things that just make us a little bit more accessible and useful and open to the outside. And we hope exude a sort of culture that, hey, like, you could come into Deed and work for however long you want to work and actually make some big changes in our economy, and realize a lot of the best work you could do in your life. I'll say, for me, I've been fortunate to have a lot of jobs in my career, and this is my favorite one I've ever had. Just the ability to make an impact in government should not be undersold. And people in tech always talk about, tackling challenges at scale. At least at Google, that was like, you heard the word scale 6 times every meeting, and that's important, big technology company. Government is exactly that too. Everything's at scale, and that's just the opportunity to make an impact at that level is powerful and important.
So any practice from Google that you think you've adopted that has worked with Indeed?
Well, one of them is just how we set goals. I mean, at Google, we use a process called objectives and key results. It's pretty simple, but you set a goal and you have measurable results that you track to see if you've achieved that goal. In government, that's a little bit less common because you're guided by the statutes that are handed you. The legislature controls a lot of what you do, so it's not like you're the CEO of a company. But I've found that it has helped our organization focus, and it has helped us prioritize and choose some things that we say, we have to do that or we won't succeed. And we've done that for 3 years running. It's a chance for us to have an ongoing conversation about where we're headed, and it's practices like that that I think translate. Some stuff doesn't translate. I never wanted to come into this job saying, let's make government just like Google. That would have been a pretty foolhardy perspective. But there are things you can translate, and then you kind of learn as you go.
Yeah, and you're bridging the gap, right?
Yeah, trying to.
So I grew up in India, and growing up, our goal used to be, when we used to growing up, was to join the civil service, right? So the government jobs were the most coveted jobs growing up in India, and I would wish my son, who's a 10th grader right now, would have that opportunity of the government coming and to high school and saying, come join us, because this is what we can do for you, and this is how you can make an impact. And I don't know whether that's happening right now, but that's a conversation for another day.
Yeah.
A quick question for both of you. John, I know that you were in high school in Minneapolis. So is it Vikings, Jets, or Giants for you?
Oh, man. The Vikings are my NFC team. Is that a diplomatic way of saying it?
That's a good answer. Even when they're 0-2 after a missed field goal at the last second yesterday.
I'm still pulling for them, yeah.
And Steve?
I actually, I got to do an internship when I was a teenager with the Vikings, so I do feel a special place in my heart having gotten to go to HQ for some period of time and meet some of the folks back in the 90s.
And Steve, I know you were in California, so where are your loyalties?
The 2 teams I picked up out there were the San Jose Quakes in soccer and the Warriors in hoops. But otherwise, I'm all Minnesota.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a good answer.
Maybe I'll just take this moment to wrap because I know we're coming up on time. But
yes.
I just want to thank you, Sabina, and the team for putting on a great day of programming. I know John and I are honored to be a part of the closing session here. And I'd say to all Minnesotans watching this, and if you're watching this from outside of Minnesota, we're building something really special here. And by we, I mean government, business, nonprofits, Tin City Startup Week, all the ecosystem builders that are part of this ecosystem here in the state, including yourself, Sabina, are really doing some great work to put Minnesota on the map. We think that with the kinds of companies that are built here, with the kind of startups that stick to it, and with the kind of corporate ecosystem to kind of surround those startups with instant customer feedback and clientele and customer opportunities, we've got some real advantages. And you're going to see your state government charge hard alongside all these other ecosystem leaders to really put this ecosystem on the map. So we're honored to learn from leaders like John, who've taken his skills from Minnesota and used them to make New York City greater. And we're going to keep working to make this a better state for startups.
That's great. Thank you for those closing words. John, anything from you?
Sorry, Sabina, what was the question?
Any closing words from you?
I really appreciate you having me here. It's great to see that this is happening. It's great to learn about all of the amazing progress being made in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and all across Minnesota. Like I said, I've got roots in Minnesota and an interest in seeing the state succeed. And there are so many smart people, so many institutions. And when you think about the ecosystem effect and how you create a place that is innovative and applies technology for greater good, Minnesota's got everything you need. And we're working hard here in New York City to make sure that we prepare for the role that artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things are going to play, but also that we do the work today to make sure that everybody's connected and that everybody has a fair chance to participate in society and to get good jobs and to thrive. And those desires, those needs, those are the same everywhere you go. Those are the same whether you're in New York City or whether you're in Minneapolis. And when I look at what's going on, I'm inspired by the progress. I'm excited for the future of Minnesota, much like I'm excited for the future here in New York City. And I'd love to stay in touch and figure out how I can help. And if anyone wants to contact me, please do reach out, cto@cto.nyc.gov, or go to our website, nyc.gov/CTO. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, John. And I would love to see us doing brainstorming with both of you in a same room one day and sharing ideas and inspiring each other. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your time and for the great conversation.
Great. Thanks, Sabina.
I know you're out of time, so no questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Take care.